toward a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians alike can live in peace and in dignity, and to commit to patient, persistent, undismayed efforts so that peace can be won. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for organizing this open debate and express my appreciation to Chef de Cabinet Rattray for the Secretary General's statement. Mr. President, the silence has been deafening on a possible solution to end the war in Gaza. Guyana had hoped that with the adoption of Resolution 2735 5 weeks ago, supporting the efforts of the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, that the bombs and bullets that continue to rain down on Gaza would have been silenced. We commend the United States, Egypt, and Qatar for their continued efforts and must remain optimistic. We, however, remind that it is the responsibility of this Council to continue to do all in its power to bring an end to this war. Mr. President, the multi-layered catastrophe in Palestine worsens with each passing day. The dimensions of this catastrophe stretch across every facet of Palestinian life, both in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Its principal characteristics are oppression and repression, indignity and impunity, destruction, deprivation, and death. Yet, even in their seemingly unending suffering, Palestinians look to the United Nations to bring this catastrophe to an end. Guyana's appeal, therefore, is for a collective mustering of political will to advance the peace process and to give the Palestinian people real hope of a secure and stable future. This is the only prospect which can equally secure a stable future for Israel and the Middle East. Mr. President, 9 months of Israel's barbaric war on Gaza has birthed a severely mutilated population, driven from corner to corner of the Strip, while bombs incessantly rain down on their severely weakened bodies. The death toll is now nearing 40,000, with the majority being women and children. What really is life in the Gaza Strip? Bombs, starvation, inadequate health care, and essential goods and services have seen the population being robbed of everything necessary for their survival. The continued impediments to the entry of humanitarian aid in contravention of legally binding decisions of the Security Council represent a complete disregard of international law obligations, particularly international humanitarian law. Guyana notes, for example, that though the Karam Shalom Karam Abu Salem crossing is open, only a trickle of aid has entered through this crossing because there is an active combat zone between the crossing and the place where Palestinian civilians are residing. It is therefore nearly impossible to transport aid via this route. We must also recall that the overall security situation in the Gaza Strip remains precarious owing to the indiscriminate bombardment and the general breakdown of law and order, a breakdown entirely attributable to the desperation engendered by the prevailing circumstances. Mr. President, for months we have seen targeted attacks against key civilian infrastructure, including healthcare facilities and schools. Refugee camps have not been spared. Indeed, attacks against camps have intensified. In recent weeks, Al-Mawasi, Burej, Nuseirat have all been attacked. Yet we hear that a ceasefire agreement cannot be reached due to red lines. What red lines are there that allow for the continuous killing of women and children and the bombing of schools, refugee camps, and hospitals? Guyana condemns this wanton violence in the strongest terms and calls on Israel to adhere to its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. We also demand that other UN member states uphold their duty to ensure that these obligations are upheld. The UN Charter and international legal instruments are not an a la carte menu from which we choose at our convenience. We are also seeing a ramping up of attacks against the UN, both in rhetoric and in physical bombardments, against UN staffers and facilities. UNRWA's facilities are being destroyed by Israel. 70% of UNRWA schools have been bombed. UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza have been decimated. Nearly 200 UNRWA staffers have been killed in this war. And the situation in the West Bank has also heated up considerably. Mr. President, this is an extremely dismal reality, and we must extinguish this inferno. Guyana calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and urges the parties to prioritize the protection of civilians as dictated by international law. We also call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and Palestinians detained without trial in Israeli prisons. We urge adherence to the various resolutions of this Council. Guyana also calls for the scaling up of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. We stress in particular that the type of food assistance reaching the civilian population must be of high nutritional value, considering the dire state of food insecurity and nutrition. We underline the obligation of Israel as the occupying power to ensure that the population has access to humanitarian relief. We call on Israel to uphold this obligation and echo the demands of the International Court of Justice in this regard. Guyana further calls for the protection of UN and humanitarian personnel. The attacks on UNRWA must stop immediately, and functioning deconfliction and notification mechanisms must become operational. We also call for actions to reduce the tensions in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and to reduce the heightened violence between Palestinians and Israelis. We further call for good faith efforts aimed at reducing tensions in the region. In closing, Mr. President, a hitherto impoverished Gaza has been set back by many more years. The Council cannot afford to slip into malaise on the Palestinian question, but must continue to proactively work towards a permanent solution to the matter. The two-state solution remains the only viable option, and stringent efforts are needed, particularly by those with influence in the region, to move the needle on its implementation.